This is it. This is the big one. A lot is riding on this Grand Prix. I'm not talking about, of course, the battle between Max and Lando that could be made or broken this weekend, but of course the other elephant in the room, which we all have to at least discuss a little bit. And I think you might know what the topic is, and I know that you are bored of people yapping on about it, but I should have you know that I'm something of a yapper myself. I briefly touched upon it in my video from yesterday, but it does seem like there is growing speculation regarding Sergio Perez from his old nemesis of last year, Helmut Marko. Yes, I know you are probably groaning at the utter mention of Checo and Helmut Marko in the same sentence, and I am actually sick and tired of talking about it as well. As far as I'm concerned, there is a contract in place and it needs to be seen through, unless there are performance clauses involved, which does mean that it can be activated. But what if I told you that there were things going on about this rumour that might make you feel slightly conflicted? That perhaps Red Bull might take a punt and do what they did in 2022 again, and look to Williams for inspiration with a driver who has become a hot topic. That's right. The rumours are swirling that Franco Colapinto might be plucked from the Williams fold and inserted into the lineup alongside Yuki Tsunoda over at VCARB for next year, and thusly, according to Helmut Marko, resolve the driver problem that Red Bull has for next year. As far as I'm concerned, I don't really see the problem. If Liam Lawson is promoted to Red Bull and Checo is dropped, that means Hadjar can come in alongside Tsunoda, so isn't that a problem solved? Apparently not. And you might be thinking that I'm contradicting what I just said about being bored about Checo and the contract stuff, but according to Helmut Marko, the contract doesn't really seem to matter. So I'm absolutely clueless as to exactly what's going on right now. I'm just going to be putting the foam of doubt on my head right now, because I'm utterly confused at this point. And also, I am not okay with this idea, even though rumours are also inferring that Colapinto's manager was asking for a team principal's or figurehead's phone number for a potential discussion regarding his driver's future. Yes, take this with a pound of salt, like I said in my video from yesterday. But it's also really interesting because it would mean that Franco's getting the recognition that he deserves. That's brilliant. But at VCARB? I really don't know, because even though he does fit the criteria of being a junior driver, as we all know from 2023, when they were AlphaTauri, it's not really conducive, that team, of bringing in an outsider that has nothing to do with the Red Bull Junior Academy, which is really confusing, because even though Colapinto has proved himself and has scored points for Williams, would he actually fit in with that work environment? And also, would he really be a long-term solution? And he would really be putting the noses out of joint of the likes of Isaac Hadjar and Arvid Lindblad, who, by the way, next year, if Hadjar doesn't win the F2 title and Bortoletto does, might end up driving for the same team, Campos. And that'll be a really interesting battle to watch next year for F2. Marco's favourite versus Horner's favourite. And of course, the potential and the ceiling of Colapinto is higher than that of De Vries, because we all have to remember that De Vries entered as a rookie at the age of 28. Colapinto is only 21. There is plenty of time to find his feet in Formula 1. In fact, you could easily argue he's already found his feet, and he might actually find more body parts as the rest of this season carries on. But there is no guarantee that Colapinto would be promoted to Red Bull Racing within a year or two, especially if Liam Lawson is sent up there and Max sees out his contract through to 2028. Franco would be stuck at VCARB, and if Red Bull and them don't get the new regulations right, it might prove to be a bad decision, especially if Williams actually ends up being quite competitive. And also, Checo is still technically contracted to Red Bull for another 2 seasons, so there's that to take into consideration. The entire situation is really suboptimal, unless there is information that they're all privy to that we, the general public, are not, which, in the case of Formula 1, is more common than not, but still. I do feel like Colapinto going over to the Red Bull fold might be a bridge too far, and as I've stated many times before, it might be wise for him to stick close to what Williams is doing, get fully abreast as to what the 2026 car is like, and then be ready in case Sainz moves on to maybe go to Red Bull Racing, because let's be real here. What Carlos has been doing in recent races, he's definitely trying to catch the eye of Red Bull and making Christian Horner regret his decision as to not hire him next to Max Verstappen. He wants to keep the front-running teams aware as to what he's doing, even though he might be in the midfield for a couple of years. But needless to say, I think this is a very, very big bit of news which has manifested itself right in time for the Mexican Grand Prix, right at the time, not that long ago, especially when all the news is pointing to potentially Checo retiring, even though I don't really see that happening. And also Colapinto has generated news for the fact that he's actually going to be having a special helmet for the Mexican and Brazilian Grand Prix, and it's a banger. It's a tribute to Carlos Reutemann, the last great Argentinian driver who drove in the 70s and 80s and finished his career with Williams. It will be used for the next 2 races and it is brilliant. And I'm glad that new fans might be enlightened of another Argentinian driver that isn't Juan Manuel Fangio. Nice one, Franco. However, there is another point of discussion to be had, and that is of Ferrari. They are truly emulating the dark horse which emblazons all of their cars. Most, including myself, believe that Ferrari would have brought a raft of upgrades to the US Grand Prix, but then apparently that was no longer the case, and nobody was quite sure exactly what they were doing. Well, it turned out that they might have actually brought updates, but those were the variety that were under the hood, which they wouldn't have to disclose in the show and tell session on Friday. According to Vasseur, there will be definite updates for the Mexico City Grand Prix. However, they are more track-specific, as is the case for pretty much every single team up and down the grid, mostly related to airflow and cooling, because engine horsepower will be reduced due to the altitude, and downforce will be far less effective. As for the rest of the season, the team will only add parts to the SF24 if the options are good, says Vasseur, which to me translates to whether or not the part will actually bring a meaningful boost in performance, and also gel well with the rest of the package to prevent a catastrophic course diversion, which saw the middle of the season for Ferrari befallen with maladies and a lack of points. And given what Ferrari are doing right now and have actually been doing since the summer break ended, I seriously get the impression that had the Spanish Grand Prix upgrade package worked as intended, Ferrari might not only be ahead of Red Bull in the constructors, but they might have been ahead of McLaren at this point, and maybe Charles Leclerc would be straight up in the championship fight, instead of just kind of hanging in there in the background just in case either Norris or Verstappen makes a really catastrophic error. And besides, their rivals are really illustrating the pitfalls in upgrading for the sake of it, because even McLaren's Austin upgrade package did not perform as anticipated, when compared to their previous updates, which always worked as intended. This one was a relative dud. Now, granted, bringing it to a sprint weekend, Austin was not an ideal solution, although they were slightly better in the race than they were in the sprint race. And by the time we get to Mexico, these upgrades might have actually provided a little bit more data, and they might have more time to set it up, and all will be good. But one thing is for sure though, Ferrari are being really careful as to what they're going to be doing. And I think this cautious approach might actually yield some good results, considering how aggressive McLaren are. They are going to be bringing more and more parts, especially for maybe at least 2 more Grand Prix, which might actually give them some good results this year, but might leave them on the back foot for development in 2025. Whereas with Ferrari, they might actually come good if they're actually a little bit more conservative, because Red Bull, they've got to catch up as well, so they might be in the pound seat for 2025 Ferrari. In other news, whilst the rookie Fernando Alonso celebrates his 400th Grand Prix in Mexico, him basically commenting on how F1 these days is too safe and the cars are too friendly, there'll be plenty of other rookies headed out for FP1. The usual suspect, Oliver Behrman, will be there, of course, as he was for the Mexico City Grand Prix last year, but this time around he's not going to be in a Haas doing it, but this time he is going to be in the Ferrari car. Why is that, you say? Well, it's because he's the reserve driver for both Haas and Ferrari has a quota to reach, you know, having 2 junior drivers in FP1 over the course of a season. There'll be Felipe Drugovich for Aston Martin. He'll get wheeled out on Alonso's car to remind himself about how close and yet so far he is to a Formula 1 seat. However, the 2 big names that are being showcased here are, of course, Kimi Antonelli for Mercedes. He's hoping he can actually do a full session this time instead of spinning out like he did in Monza. And then, of course, the IndyCar star over at McLaren, Pato O'Ward. A very interesting mix, Ireland and Mexico, but one thing is for sure, both cultures know how to have a good time involving plenty of beverages, and if you look at the photos of support that Pato has received in his home country, I can tell you, this was a smart move from McLaren to have him included. Especially since this is actually a nice little bit of a promotion, because for the longest time, Pato would only get opportunities at Abu Dhabi for either FP1 or for the young driver test, and we gotta remember, Pato is now approaching 25, in fact he is 25, so his time to get on the Formula 1 grid is fleeting, and the fact that he doesn't really now have enough super license points in which to get that license and a chance to have a race seat really is getting into that crunch point, because that 2021 third place in the IndyCar Championship, that will have expired soon, and after that, think he's only got like 22 points or something, maybe 25 due to all of the FP1 sessions that he's done. But hey, getting to do it in Mexico and actually getting to interact with loads of your fans, that's a real treat. But you've also got to take into consideration, McLaren already has Gabriel Bortoleto primed and ready for F1 should he get the gig over at Sauber for next year. Oh, and by the way, Robert Schwartzman gets an FP1 session for Mexico. But as for McLaren, Zach is probably weighing up his options for the future, as well as maybe giving O'Ward a nice little treat for his hard work for the IndyCar campaign, especially his second place in the Indy 500. So yeah, I don't really think it will amount to a proper Formula 1 seat, unless there is a mass exodus of both Piastri and Norris at the same time. So maybe we might end up with O'Ward and Bortoleto driving for McLaren, which would be completely wild, and the Americas would be loving McLaren for that. But as for the other teams, since they seem to be completely under the radar at the moment, how might they fare here, aside from getting FP1 drivers? Well, if VCARB can capitalise on their better performance in Austin and rekindle the pace they had last year where Daniel Ricciardo netted a top 5 in qualifying and a big chunk of points to get the team off of last place and put Haas squarely in it, then I could easily see both Tsunoda and Lawson scoring points here. Which one would end up scoring more and come out as the better driver at a really crucial time in both of their careers? It remains to be seen, because Lawson has shown that he has still got it. Even though he'd been out for a year, he can still score points. But we also got to remember that Tsunoda was on course for points last year in Mexico, until he had that clash with Piastri in turn 1, which saw him tumble back down the order. But then also, you got to remember that this year, upgrades and strategy calls really put paid to more championship points, so they might want to get in a hurry in terms of repeating the move of overtaking Haas for a second year in a row, and really show what for and that they changed their ways. Points for them might be hard to find should Mercedes especially have gotten their upgrades back on track, and the weather proved to be more forgiving toward the W15, since temperatures are not expected to rise above 22 degrees, and it won't be a clear day either. As for Williams, could we see some heroics from them and Colapinto score yet again, and Albon may be able to get a point or two? Well, never say never or anything, because we've got to remember, historically, the Williams is an absolute speed machine down the longest straight, or one of the longest straights, in Formula 1. And due to the altitude and the lack of drag, we could maybe see Williams start to get closer and closer to the record they already have of the fastest top speed in a Formula 1 car in an active Formula 1 session that they got with Valtteri Bottas. I think it was 2016 or something like that. But it really depends on how much of that legacy trait is still in the FW46 and what has been lost in the quest to find some downforce. But maybe they might go for a relatively low downforce spec, and if, after all of the surprises that we've seen recently, one of their drivers gets into Q3, because down that straight they will be really tricky when it comes to trying overtaking them. As for Aston Martin, will the pain continue? Well, I think so. I was also made aware by Big Data F1 of a harrowing statistic regarding Alonso, and that after 19 Grand Prix, he has only scored 10 points more than he did during one of the annus horribilis years of McLaren in 2016, and that was his best season he had during his second McLaren stint. Sure, 2024 has been better than 2016, and it will continue to be better, because I can easily see maybe Alonso getting a couple of more points before the season's out, but we've also got to remember what he was able to do last year and where he was. He's got 62 points at the moment, and how many points did Alonso have at this time around about the Mexico Grand Prix? He had about 183. So he scored a third of the points that he was able to get from last year. And okay, Law, surely he can do better than he did in Mexico last year, right? Well, sure, easy, absolutely. If the car's reliable, then sure, because he retired. I doubt he can do much worse. Hey, look, I'm going to try and find positives for his 400th Grand Prix. Give me a break. And a break might be what mechanics need after FP2 this time out, as it's going to be apparently getting an additional 30 minutes, so that means Pirelli can get more info about their tyres for next year, plus use an additional compound of tyre which was talked about earlier in the year. You know, the supposed C6 tyre that Pirelli might want to introduce for next year to go with their C5 through C0, which is basically the C6, the Hypersoft or the pink coloured tyre from 2018, so a really sticky fast tyre that might be effectively a qualifying tyre. But whether or not we'll actually see it in action in a Formula 1 Grand Prix over a course of a weekend, I don't really know, because we were supposed to see the C0 in action, but we've never seen it. Is it some kind of development tyre or something? Because it's meant to be the well-hardest tyre on the entire Pirelli packet. Yeah, that tyre's well hard. If you use it in qualifying, it'll do ya! And also, we'll have no clue as to which team or driver is using them, because they're not going to have any colours on the side. So apparently it's going to be a random allocation as to who gets the C6 tyre and who gets all the other compounds. Most of the time it's usually an average C3 or something like that, right in the middle. But what might be cool is that we get to use these C6 tyres for sprint qualifying SQ3 to really illustrate the speed element of the sprint, but again, this is just a case of conjecture. It might prove to be another fleeting idea from Pirelli, or maybe a misguided or unthought out one, like the whole Bear Trophy for Austin, the Hiru mascot that they came up with, you know, the helmeted driver with apparently Mickey Mouse ears. Well, no, apparently Bear Brick might have had something to do with the copyright infringement claim. That's why Carlos and Max got those just random tyres or something like that. They bounced them on the podium, whereas Charles got a replica of the 2018 trophy that Kimi Räikkönen had. So yeah, it was a little bit of a complete farce, the podium ceremony. But what I'll tell you is not a farce are my top 5 predictions, because I am going to share with you right now, copyright infringed free. Now when it comes to, I think, who win the Mexico City Grand Prix, I think it's pretty much a foregone conclusion. Given that the upgrades have worked as intended, thankfully, after all of this time, and of course his track record at this track at the Hermano Rodriguez circuit, Max Verstappen, I reckon, is going to be securing yet another win in Mexico. They might have found a solution to their upgrading problems, and they might be able to capitalise on the efforts and the relative success that they had at Austin. Even though Max only got 3rd place and was behind the Ferraris, Ferrari may not do so well here. Red Bull have a good track record at this circuit. He just seems to be in a good place at the moment. He does have the advantage in the championship. It's a track that he likes, he enjoys, and I really don't see any other difference, because McLaren, their upgrades have proven to be inconclusive from Austin. Ferrari, their track record here has been relatively inconsistent, although last year it was pretty good. But I just really think that Red Bull might have actually found its way again, and we might start to see the rest of the season this year riddled with plenty of podiums and maybe the occasional win for Max Verstappen. I don't think total dominance, but I think Red Bull is certainly back in there, and I certainly think Mexico might be a good place where we see a race victory for Max. Unless Max Verstappen gets some kind of mechanical issue befall him which sees him tumble down the order, or maybe a reintroduction of the issue that he had in Austin which required him to pit in for slightly longer, I don't really see any other different result other than him getting the win. And then in 2nd place, this was a little bit of a tough one, because I wasn't quite sure what Ferrari would be able to do given their relatively iffy situation regarding tyre temperature at the circuit. But you know what? I'm going to take a punt and say that Charles Leclerc would be 2nd place, because again, he is a driver who is in a really good place, and Ferrari have really found their groove again after a really tricky mid-season period and a really major slump. And again, we need to look at what the tyre temperatures are going to be handling with the weather. Apparently it's going to be 22 degrees on Sunday, overcast somewhat, and that might mean that we might get occasional periods where the temperature might go up, it might go down again. It might affect the Ferrari quite badly, like it did last year in qualifying, which saw to it they were slightly further down the order in Q3. But I would like to think that Fred Vasseur would have anticipated this, and that the car right now might be a little bit more versatile when it comes to fluctuations in temperature and overall weather conditions. And also, the upgrade seems to be good, and their conservative approach of only updating the car if they think the car will actually benefit from these components might actually prove to pay dividends in their effort to not only get 2nd place in the Constructors, but maybe take the spot from McLaren in an absolute coup. And the first time they would have gotten any silverware in F1 since 2008. So you think McLaren have been waiting a long time. Ferrari, their wait has been pretty extensive as well. And I reckon that Charles will give Max a good fight, because I don't see Max just running off into the sunset 10, 15, 20 seconds ahead like Charles and Lando have been able to demonstrate this year. It'll be somewhere about 5 seconds or something like that after a really good contested battle. Then in 3rd place, and this is me kind of being generous given McLaren's track record here, I got Lando Norris, and yes, of course, their upgrades from Austin might have bedded in, and they might actually be quite good here, and they might actually be able to make the most of the conditions and maybe get a little bit more downforce where others might be lacking, but it's really hard to give a really good confident prediction for McLaren, given that, historically, at this track, they've really not done that well. And as for Lando, his best result was last year, 5th place, and putting them in 3rd place is quite a good progression, but given that there's a potential championship fight at the moment, this is not ideal, considering this is one of Max's best tracks. He has won here 5 times and could make it a 6th, whereas with Lando, I cannot see him winning unless these upgrades have really been optimized and they've managed to gain extensive data, and then also with the tyre conditions, because they can be quite laborious. There might be a case to be able to give him a higher position or justify third place. As to what we saw in Austin, that McLaren car is quite kind to its tyres. That might actually benefit them here even more so than it did in the United States. But again, I don't feel that confident to be able to give them any higher than third, and that being Lando, of course. And as for Piastri, I can tell you right now, I don't see him in the top 5. Austin, it wasn't really a good track for him. He even said so himself. I think that's one of his bogey tracks. And hey, I want Oscar to prove me wrong. I want him to blow away expectations like he did with everyone in Baku. No one saw that coming. But as an Oscar fan, I have to manage my expectations even more so than any other driver. So that means I don't show my bias. And the same thing goes for the lead McLaren driver, and I just cannot put Lando any higher than third place. Otherwise, it would just be not realistic. And yes, of course, I know most of my predictions don't tend to be right, but I want to at least come to some sort of logical conclusion from my own brain. So yeah, that's where we are right now. And where we are right now regarding fourth place is going to be that of Carlos Sainz. Because I think it's quite evident, as we're entering the end phase of 2024, Carlos has really tipped up his progress again, and maybe Ferrari might be lending some support to him in their efforts to try and take away the Constructors' Championship, now that they're pretty close to McLaren, and they're within single figures of Red Bull for second, and I think they would love to take some scalp away from Red Bull after what they've been through this year and the last few. And not only that, like I mentioned earlier, Carlos will want to prove up and down the grid that he has still got it, and that the time will come where he will be ready to return to the front running pack when there is a slot available. Williams might be only a temporary solution, but he might be able to perform miracles and really give that team a good leg up, like he was able to do when McLaren believed in him to become their team leader in 2019, and look where that got him. A gig at Ferrari. Fantastic. Yeah, I know, I might be getting ahead of myself, and I might be a little bit overly optimistic, but we've got to really recognize that in Austin, the chili was incredibly spicy. Nobody saw that coming in the sprint, where he just completely ran roughshod over Lando and got second place right on the last lap. And then he was able to bag Ferrari a 1-2, their first in the United States in nearly 20 years. That was really good performance after a time where he'd been relatively mute. And now he's actually kicking on, and he now might actually start to be troubling Oscar Piastri for fourth place in the championship. That is a real task and a real goal that Carlos will want, especially since he's had a lot more beef than I ever expected with Oscar, given what's happened this year and the year before. And then fifth place, you might be wondering where this guy has been. Checo, fifth place. Now, you might be thinking, come on, Law, this is his home circuit. Surely he'd be doing better than fifth. Well, we got to remember Checo's recent performances, and fifth place would be one of his best results in a very, 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 very long time. More often than not, it's a 7th place or an 8th place. Him finishing potentially ahead of both Mercedes, that will be an absolute triumph, especially given the fact that Mercedes might be really good in the slightly milder conditions opposed to 29, 30, 31 degrees that we got in Austin. So you might be thinking of being a bit pessimistic, but we've got to remember that Checo has been no higher than third here. And even though he might have terrific support, and the home advantage might be the most potent than even perhaps Silverstone for the British drivers, even though Checo might have the fully upgraded RB20. Fifth place, I think, might be quite doable. Any higher, I cannot confidently or willingly give him. But I feel like this might be a little bit of a step forward, so hopefully the recovery that he got last year in getting back podiums again. So yeah, I'm putting Sergio 5th place. He could be higher, maybe 4th place at a pinch if we get some incidents ahead or a really good fortuitous safety car or something. And also, his efforts to try and get back the Constructors' Championship or at least solidify 2nd place, him being in 5th and the 2 Ferrari drivers ahead of him and one of the McLarens ahead of him as well, and maybe the other McLaren not too far behind him. I think maybe Piastri might be 6th or 7th or something like that. I think it's going to be a very tall order for Checo to be able to do anything at a track which is probably very, very crucial for his future in Formula 1. Here's hoping he can absolutely eclipse the field and he gets a home win. If that happens, I think everyone will be happy for him, but again, let's just see what happens on Sunday, yeah? And speaking of stepping up, Alex Albon might need to do so over at Williams, given how quickly his teammate has acclimated to Formula 1, even though he had a bit of a sleeper junior career. And Franco's race engineer says there's plenty more where that came from. To find out why I'm actually buying in heavily into the hype of Franco Colapinto and think Alex Albon should be really worried, go and watch this video next, because there is a lot more to it than just blind hype.